I want to begin by telling you of a great achievement of mine this past week. I created an amazing sculpture. It's doubly amazing in that I've never sculpted before. And I will tell you how I made that amazing. I'll describe my sculpture. It's a naked woman, but you don't get to see a lot of her beauty. Because she's bending down. And so what you see is her back and her legs and flowing hair. It was really impressive. I'll tell you how I came to it. But first, I'm going to talk about touring. Did you know that the word latour is a Hebrew word? And it comes from our parsha of Parsha Shelach, in which it begins as follows on page 840, if you want to take a peek, in the Eitz Chaim. And God spoke to Moses, saying, Shlach lecha anashim, send for you people, v'yaturu et eretz Canaan, and they will tour the land of Canaan. Asher ani noten lifnei Yisrael, which I give before the children of Israel, ish echad l'matei avotav tishlachu. Each of these individuals will be from a respective tribe, so you will send them. Kol nisi vahem, each a leader, each a prince of the tribe. V'yishlach otam Moshe memidbar, and you shall send them Moses from the desert, from Paran, according to the word of Adonai, all of them, Anashim Rashay B'nai Yisrael Hema. All of them will be individuals who are heads of Israel. And then a long list of their names. Well, to this case, touring goes amok. It's not a successful outing. So a little context. The people have been traveling for 2 years. Signs and wonders, plague after plague. They emerge, crossing the sea of reeds that has split for them. An extraordinary miracle. And then they are free. And the first thing they do is sing a song of celebration. And on day 3, the concern begins. The complaining, the rebelling. Moses, we're in a desert. Where are we going? Where's the water? Where's the food? Those are legitimate concerns. Signs and wonders, yes, but reality is reality, Moses. And so, more miracles. Manna, a kind of dew, is either found in the morning. It's found in the morning. It's not clear if it's coming as rain or if it's dew that is there, enabling the people for the rest of what will be their journey to be, if you will, fed by God each morning. 2 years have gone by. And now, before them, Eretz Zavar Chalav Udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey, which means a land good for goats and date palms. And so, before them is this land. And the people, as Moses will recount the story, it's not clear here fully context, but in Deuteronomy, Moses will say, you came to me and insisted that you wanted spies. After all, God said God's going to take you into the land, but you insisted. And so here, as it's understood, Shelach lecha anashim v'yaturu et haaretz Canaan, send for you spies to tour the land of Canaan. Was, if you want it, go right ahead. I'm not going to stop you, but it's your idea. Now, this is not exactly, if you think about the goal of spying out the land, this is not the way you would do it. Our Haftorah, taken from the second chapter of Joshua, is also, now 38 years later, the way you would do it. Namely, 2 spies that are really spies, that are undercover, that will find a place to hide, and a woman who will provide safety. But 12 going into a foreign land, that's a busload. That's not a secret. And, at least according to the Torah, word is out that there is this people in the desert that has brought down the mighty Egypt, that no less than the Pharaoh has said, I can't take any more, go. Word is out that God has power. And now the 12 enter Canaan, ostensibly to scout it out. And the orders that they're given are as follows. Verse 17, go up there into the Negev, they're in the south, and then continue into the hill country and see what kind of country it is. Are the people who dwell in it strong or weak, few or many? Is the country in which they dwell good or bad? Are the towns they live in open or fortified? Is the soil rich or poor? Is it wooded or not? And take pains to bring back some of the fruit of the land. Now, it happened to be the season of the first ripe grapes, which is probably October-ish. Aviva Zornberg, the great contemporary Bible scholar, said that Moses gave bad instructions, which is why the spies failed. I love her analysis. She said, reality is not good or bad. It is good and bad, no matter what one does. It's nuanced. And the fact that they had to think in terms of absolutes, yes or no, created what will be the outcome, which is panic. So it's a lovely analysis in terms of Moses was thinking like a man. That's how she presented it. What's the bottom line, good or bad, rather than a nuanced understanding of the possible. So they go into the land. They scout it out. You know that symbol of tourism of Israel, of 2 people on their shoulders, each carrying a huge thing of grapes? That's the image of this return, of this moment. They come back and they say, yes, it's a very, very rich land. Look at these grapes. There's great produce. But the people who live there, they're like giants. And we were like grasshoppers compared to them. And then they add, and they looked at us also as if we were grasshoppers. And already Midrash Tanchuma, an earlier Midrash that'll get picked up by the Hasidic master Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, will say, all right, so you felt that they were very big and tall, but how do you know how you looked in their eyes? And in fact, in the Haftorah, in that story of Joshua 38 years later, the people are terrified of the Israelites because they've heard of their great powers through God. But the people panic and they begin to cry. And they say, Moses, why did you take us out here just to die? Take us back to Egypt. And God will lose patience. And God will say to Moses, let me just wipe out these people and start over with you. I've had enough. Except there are 2. Caleb, he's the only one who speaks, but also implied Joshua, representing Joshua, Judah, Caleb, Benjamin, who say, yes, they are formidable. Yes, it is a great land, and we trust in God. We don't know how we would do it, but we trust that we have a guide who has enabled us and will enable us to move forward. And so, in sum, it all unravels. God will relent in our Torah reading when Moses will say to God, "You're not starting over with me." It's quite an offer. It's bad PR for you. What will this do to your reputation if you wipe everybody out? They're going to say you took them out into the desert just to kill them. You're going to have to make up. And God will forgive. And when we chant, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, Erech Apayim V'Rav Chesed, which we chant in front of the ark on holidays, Adonai, Adonai, God, God, you are a God of mercy. That is God's self-description in our Torah reading in the midst of forgiving the people, almost as if God is surprised God's self. So now let me tell you about my surprise of being a great sculptor. I am overstating it. I'm not a great sculptor, but I did make a great sculpture. I had the privilege this last week to go to Mexico with my wife, Linda, to Rancho La Porta. Rancho La Porta is located in Tecate, Mexico, and Tecate is only a 2-hour drive from here. It's just east of San Diego, and there's a border crossing there. It's only about 240 people in Wikipedia, so according to Wikipedia, who live in Tecate, California. And there's about 100,000 people who live in Tecate, Mexico, across the border. And there's a resort there that was one of the first, if not the first, to be a wellness resort created in 1940 by a crazy man named Edmund Zakeli. He was from Sighet. Sighet is the Romanian town where Elie Wiesel was born. Edmund Zakeli called himself the professor, and he was way ahead of the times. He insisted on farm-to-table eating, and eating vegetarian, and exercising, and doing inner work. And he wrote books on philosophy. And he married his third wife. She was 17 when he was 37. Jewish woman from Brooklyn. And it was the war, and he didn't want to go back to Romania. And he couldn't stay in America for visa reasons, so he created this resort in Mexico on the border in 1940. The wife, Deborah, is now 99 years old, and she was giving a lecture, but we had to leave on Wednesday. She was lecturing at Tecate on Wednesday night. So in sum, there's a little Jewish history to Rancho La Porta, and it's a place in any time slot that there's 5 kinds of activities. There are different kinds of exercises. There's the opportunity to do art and mindfulness. One of my favorite teachers of Buddhist mindfulness is a Jewish woman named Sylvia Borstein, who lives in Marin County. She was teaching for 2 weeks, apparently for 50 years she's been coming to teach, with her daughter, who's a life coach, and she was giving classes at another point in the day. So there was a richness of learning opportunities, and in this case, I had once spent time with Sylvia Borstein at a meditation retreat, but didn't get to know her. This week I got to know her, which leads to sculpting. I had a tough decision to make with Linda. We could have either done, in our choice of the 6 choices in the time slot, a 2-hour class in chocolate making with apparently a world-class boutique chocolate maker across from the resort, or sculpting. Well, I had never sculpted before, and I saw the model of what the 5 of us in our little class were going to be making. I described it with all this extraordinary detail of this woman. She had the right curves. It was a woman, and long hair on her, leaning down. The teacher shared with us that he had been a teacher of sculpting for 30 years. And it took him, his father and grandfather, his uncle, had all been sculptors. And he said, when I began to learn sculpting, I was an apprentice. And it was not like they were showing me what to do. But it took me 30 years for me to teach you how to make this sculpture that we're all going to do together. I had seen it already because they had a large bronze of this same figure in the grass in one of the public spaces. I couldn't believe that people who were untrained could create such an extraordinary product. So we took 4 pieces of clay, a little smaller than a fist, balls that we made ourselves. Clay balls. And then we had them, more like apricots, large apricots, 4 more balls. And then like large cherries, 4 more balls. And then what he showed us is you take the bigger balls and you make them look almost like drumsticks, like a drumstick. And those would be the legs, and you bend it. You then take the others, and they get shaped into the torso. The bottom line is, it was painting by color, which I used to do as a child. And I would do these remarkable artworks, painting by color. Not that I could really draw a German Shepherd in all those remarkable colors, but I took such delight in painting by colors. And by the end of this 2 hours, each of us had created this magnificent sculpture. For $450, you could get it bronzed. One young woman across from me paid the money. I took a lot of pictures. I was quite proud. But I also knew that all I had done was follow his instruction in terms of enabling the unfolding that I would never have been able to have imagined myself. I wouldn't have known how to begin, let alone to do something that, it's too bad I didn't send pictures to Louise. She would have been very impressed. Which is only to say that expertise matters. That knowing how to break things down into component parts can sometimes produce a result that a novice would never know how to do, never know how to begin. And I said to Linda, I would consider bronzing something if it was my idea, if I had the talent to indeed know how to make a sculpture. But this was painting by numbers, not worthy of that kind of investment. And so, to our Torah reading, we have 10 spies who are not professionals. In fact, the rabbis will comment that they're political appointees. This is not a tour of spies who are really going to check out the land. These are political leaders who are going to look it over with an agenda, either or, in order to reassure the people and fail abysmally. And so, one takeaway from Shelach Lecha is beware of politics when you got a very important task to do. You got to always understand what's the goal, and the goal, it wasn't only the questions that were flawed, it was the way it was set up, which is sending a dozen people who each are politically significant but have no skill. The second piece that links to my story of the sculpture is how important expertise is. Our teacher said it took him 30 years to be able to learn how to take one of the symbols, because it was a sculpture created many years before at Rancho La Porta, and break it down into its component parts to take novices and enable everybody to create a replica that also was somewhat distinctive. And so expertise matters for everything. All too often, we watch and experience life as the end product and don't take the time to really know what goes into it. That's only natural. We only have so much time. And so one last component of significance on this day of June 5th, 2021. It was June 5th, 1967, that the Six-Day War began in Israel. And so Israel is very much on my mind today because of that anniversary. Now, you may recall, I was 13 at the time, so I do recall the fear. My parents, Holocaust survivors, mind you, 1967 is just 12 years. Wait, 22 years. 22 years since the end of World War II. 22 years. It's more than double that, right? 67 till now. 54 years. So 64 years. 64 years. Almost 3 times as long. So reality was very much, for Jews around the world, a reality that things can go wrong. In 1967, when Egypt closed off the Straits of Tehran, a declaration of war, Suez Canal had not been available to Israel, but now it was the Red Sea that leads to Eilat that was closed off. And Jordan and Syria amassed on the borders. You may recall Egypt and Syria had been a united country with Nasser just before then, and Nasser declared, "We will destroy Israel." 3 nations, large armies, and uncertainty. Israel, as we all know, won that war in 3 days by air. It took 6 days to achieve the ceasefire. But in the very beginning, the tanks on Israel's border created a sense of great fear and gravity and many loss of lives. But Israel was able to engage in kind of a blitzkrieg with Ariel Sharon being in charge of the tanks in the Sinai Desert. And the air that Israel dominated in terms of immediately creating and stopping the air forces of each of those countries meant that Israel controlled the skies. And it felt like a miracle. It felt like a miracle that Israel defeated 3 larger countries than itself, and for the first time was able to conquer the old city of Jerusalem and enable that reclamation of Jerusalem as a holy place that one could go to for the first time since the creation of the State of Israel. And so the 6-day war felt biblical. But up close, it's a bit like that sculpture, meaning Israel was able to achieve it because it had air superiority. It had air superiority because it had moved forward in terms of its technological skills. Some say that if Israel had to do that war today, it could have done it in hours in terms of the advance technologically. Which is only to say there's reason to pause and to feel the achievement of Israel in 1967. There is reason to feel the wow of having felt it could end, and instead of ending, a flourishing of power. Now, I will add that it was only 6 years later, in 1973, when Israel would be surprised in the Yom Kippur War and would be devastated in terms of the numbers of casualties. I was in Israel from 72 to 74. 72, the country felt like it could do no wrong. There was an quality almost of inebriation of look how powerful we are. And that hubris of we could take out the Arabs as we did in 6 days with no difficulty led to a lengthy war of weeks and so many casualties. And more could have even been far worse. And so one was reminded of not being arrogant, of knowing that a success does not determine security. Life in Israel, politics in Israel, is very complicated. Who would have imagined 2 weeks ago, the ceasefire went into effect only 2 weeks ago on Friday night, that this week it looks like a coalition will be put together where the linchpin to enable that coalition to reach the number 61 of 120 would be a fundamentalist Muslim party that had been negotiating with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel because they have fundamentalism in common. Which is only to say Israel up close is far more complicated than how it gets related to. The most important thing to know is that Israel is not America, meaning the majority of Israeli Jews are people of color. The majority come from Muslim North African countries and countries like Ethiopia. So seeing Israel literally in black and white terms, as it often gets presented by Americans who see power against lack of power, is not the reality of the complexity of Israel. Which is only to say, back to the need for expertise. We would like to see things like that sculpture and just go, wow, you did that? Not knowing that I could only do that because I was literally being told step by step of how to do it. I couldn't do it on my own. And it's another kind of metaphor that what we see in life needs the patience and expertise to understand how it comes about. And without that, one is looking at fool's gold, which leads to one last piece. And that is our experience at Rancho La Porta was the experience of pre-COVID. In order to be a guest, you had to be vaccinated. And because everybody was vaccinated in this 3,000-acre resort, it was like pre-COVID. You could go to classes without a mask, as we are still in our sanctuary according to California guidelines. You could even hug people after spending lunch with them. It was like, wow, I remember this. I remember that I didn't used to think about it. It was just a normal given. It is the achievement of our scientists that we are returning to a semblance of normalcy. I'm not a scientist. I don't know the details of how vaccines were created. And yet, I can say, wow, that we have vaccines that are our path back to normalcy. And so on this parsha of Shelach Lecha, to pull this together, Shelach Lecha describes a failure of mission, a tour gone amok. Because The purpose of the tour was never defined. It was politicized and failed. In the Haftorah, there was success, and it would lead to entry into the land, because there was the use of skilled spies. There's a time and a place for that kind of touring the land. We are emerging from COVID because of experts, and they are to be praised, and they are to be followed, because I am not an expert. But with expertise, if I am a good student, I can do amazing things. We can go from COVID to normalcy again because of the guidance of those experts. Sadly, some of those expertise gets politicized. Let us not do so. To solve a problem requires skill, trust of those who are skillful, not in politics, but in this case, in science. And so, Shelach Lecha is about touring, but touring purposefully. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, may my experience with sculpting motivate me to know that expertise matters, and more. May it leave me curious to try and sculpt, knowing it will take me a very, very, very long time to create anything as impressive as I created by following instructions. But let me be creative too, and let me know that in all aspects of our life, there are areas in which we are each skilled and expert, and areas in which we are to be students. In our tradition, a scholar is called a Talmid Chacham, a student of wisdom. May we, with curiosity and humility, be students of those with skills to allow our lives to flourish in your light and with the response of wonder. Amen.